Hi, everyone. I'm Richard. I know some of you, I recognize some names in the chat, but I'll try to say something new. For those of you who are new to me, the part of my research I want to present here is the research on supporting researchers, often isolated, underfunded, struggling researchers in their careers. I'm extremely interdisciplinary, but I'm mainly an evolutionary biologist who studies humans. But I'm very sympathetic to people who work in the humanities as well. And I don't think that what I'm going to say today is irrelevant to studies of, say, literature, corpus, or things of that sort. And maybe if there are questions of that kind at the end, I'd be happy to entertain them. What I want to talk about today is workflow in a logical sense and how we can use it to do better science. And I'm going to try to direct my comments away from the usual discourse in open science circles about publication reform or funding reform or so on, and focus much more on what you, the isolated researcher with limited resources, can do now and in the near future to do better research. Of course, what I'm going to suggest we can do is also integrated with publishing reform and funding reform and peer review reform and so on. And I'll say a little bit about that at the end. But really, I'm thinking about supporting junior researchers who are often quite frustrated in their institutional context they work in. The motivating metaphor here of the guerrilla approach is guerrilla warfare, illustrated here in a popular movie. This is an old movie now in Star Wars. I forget which one. The Empire invaded some moon, and the indigenous peoples of this moon, who were technologically outmatched by the Empire, managed to push back and defeat the invading forces. And it's a classic, somewhat comically depicted example of guerrilla warfare, which is now a serious area of scholarly investigation and a serious part of military tactics as well. What does it mean? Well, let me give you a better historical example. This is a train in the Arabian desert. You can go visit it, I'm told. I have not, but it's on my bucket list. This is the train that was derailed during the First World War by T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, and his Arab collaborators. Is one of the most famous and successful examples of guerrilla warfare. And there's so much historical context here, and I'm just going to skip it, even though I love it to death. But the idea was the Ottoman Empire controlled the Arab countries at the time, and T. Lawrence, who was a spy working for the British Crown, was there organizing local resistance, which was vastly outmatched. But they did a tremendous amount of damage to the Ottoman Empire in the area, and eventually opened up a path to victory. Lawrence went on to do a lot of writing about the tactics he used at the time. He didn't coin the term guerrilla warfare. That obviously comes from South America. But he actually wrote an encyclopedia entry for the Encyclopedia Britannica on guerrilla warfare. And here's just a short little quote, if you'll indulge me. The members of the guerrilla warfare bands had to keep always cool, for the excitement of a bloodlust would impair their science. He uses the word science repeatedly in this article. And their victory depended on a just use of speed, concealment, accuracy of fire. Guerrilla warfare is far more intellectual than a bayonet charge. So in the whole article about guerrilla warfare, T. Lawrence emphasizes over and over again, how guerrilla warfare is extremely tactical. You always strike only when you want, only at the right points, because you're outmanned. The technology of the enemy is vastly superior. A frontal assault will never work. But when it works because it is a highly intellectual endeavor. I want to extend this metaphor to what we do as researchers. And this is obviously a little bit playful and analogous, but I think there's some truth to this analogy. Let me start out with the first part of it, is that scientists are trying to understand nature. And culture, but as part of nature. But and nature is vast and overpowering. It's incredibly opaque. The causes we're trying to discover as scientists are not written on the surface simply to be read. we don't even have direct access to nature, right? We make these measurements, which are proxies and so on. So the frontal assault on nature does not work in the vast majority of cases. And I'm a statistician, and so I could list off lots of particular computational examples of how the frontal assault cannot work just on information theoretic grounds. But in the casual sense, correlation is extremely common, but causes are sparse. Right? It's not unusual. Everything's correlated, but most of those correlations don't arise for causal reasons. And causation isn't even faithful. This is a particular bit of statistical jargon. And what that means is that many natural systems have thermostats in them that maintain homeostasis. And so when you perturb the system, you can't see the effect of it. And so you can't even read causes off of experiments. There are lots of natural systems like that where you have to think very, very cleverly about how you can understand where the causes are. So all of this complexity also is represented in the research we do. There's this tangle of transformations of data and measurements. And if you make a mistake in any part of it, it can ruin everything. It's not like, so data processing all the way down your pipeline to how the final results are calculated, a mistake in any of that can ruin the whole thing. It seems like this is an impossible task. Who would ever accept a career as a researcher, right? Why not do something that's possible? But we all love this, right? This is what we set out to do. We become scientists not for the income, but for the spiritual rewards. And we do learn things about the world. But how do we ever learn anything at all? I hope this meme on the screen is appealing to some of you as well. This is, as a statistician, this is what I feel like the advice from statisticians is statisticians don't agree on how to solve these problems either. Why am I telling you about this? Well, it relates to these big problems in the replicability crisis as it exists in various ways in different fields, and what organizations like PCI are trying to do to reform our institutions to make things more open so we can discover errors better and have improved peer review and greater efficiencies and so on. I hope that's a reasonable description of PCI's goals. I know they're bigger than that. And I'm not going to go into all the evidence for or against the reproducibility crisis. If you'll forgive me, I'll just assume that most of this audience is passingly familiar with it. I want to say something maybe you're not so familiar with, though, is that the reforms that we want to bring about to deal with the kinds of errors that appear in the scientific literature, which slow down progress and hurt accumulation, it's very we don't know how to fix these things. I think that's part of it. Is it's not clear exactly what to do, and we have spirited debates about the reforms because it's not clear. We don't have a mature meta science to direct science, and that's the direction I want to go in my comments. Just a small part of that. I was at a couple of Future of Scientific Publishing conferences last summer. One of them was in London, held by the Royal Society, and it was launched off with the opening talk by Mark Walport, who's long been interested in publishing reform, and he's pushing very hard for the Royal Society journals to modernize and improve and so on. I think he's very sincere about this. I want to highlight in his opening comments, he's a biologist, and one of the things he said is if you read biology journals today or you're an editor in a biology journal, you're shocked by the size of the supplementals. All the calls for having materials and transparency and a bunch of robustness checks have led to these massive inflation of supplementals. And it's not unusual now to have 100-page or even longer supplementals full of analyses and links to data sets and so on. And it's really not reasonable to expect unpaid peer reviewers to read this stuff, and they don't. That's for sure, for the most part. And if you, like me, get interested in a particular literature and you really want to understand an article, you need to read the supplemental, and it's like reading a book, a very badly organized book. Right. And I'm not going to name any particular papers, but on average, the supplementals are not as well written as the main. And it's quite difficult to make up your own mind about the quality of the paper, even after you've gone through a lot of the supplemental. It's quite difficult to understand this. And this is a different kind of crisis. So you imagine a situation where we have maximum transparency, but we still can't make sense of the published literature. And this was the issue that Sir Walport was bringing up. And what can we do instead? But that supplemental, the length of those supplementals and their complexity reflects the complexity of biology. Biology is an extremely is a complexity science, and the systems contain a bunch of little entities that interact in complex ways, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand them with informatics. Let me pivot to publishing then. And the other sense of nature, nature in italics, as the journal, is also opaque because it's not exactly clear how we evaluate things that are published in it. And the 100-page supplementals is one part of it. But it's also the case that the current standards of publication and peer review don't really emphasize the intersubjective comprehensibility of the work. Method sections typically contain no justification for the methods used. There's not a logical flow from the questions to the measurements, the research design to the statistical processing. Even in a complete method section that has all the steps, the justifications will be missing. And so it's difficult to evaluate why this was done instead of something else. What's the counterfactual? Just lots of what I call ad hoc analyses. And quite often in the highest impact factor journals like Nature, the results are justified because of their surprise value. If they're big, if true, if these results turn out to be true, then it's a big deal. And Nature really loves papers of that kind, you all know. Often the specific scientific goals are only very loosely connected to the measurements. It's clear the measurements have something to do with the phenomenon. And then the statistical processing is just whatever it takes to make the figure two that brings home the results. I'm not saying anything new here. We all know about this, and many people, including many funders and governments, are convinced this has something to do with the replicability crisis. But it's not clear what the counterfactual is and how to address this because the science remains very complex. So I'm going to run through a bunch of slides here and try to give you an idea for the kinds of guerrilla tools that small teams, even individual scientists, already have at their disposal to deal with these problems. Ways for you to write better papers that peer reviewers and your colleagues can read and understand the justification for, even if they disagree with you. At least they can comprehend it and therefore make better evaluations of it. To say is openness is not enough. Papers have to be written in a way that they achieve the comprehensibility, intersubjective comprehensibility. I'm paraphrasing Karl Popper here from the German. But let me lay out before I get to those ideas, which I think you can walk away with some hopefully positive feeling about it. Let me talk about what I mean as the terms of victory in this metaphor of guerrilla warfare against nature. What are the terms of victory? We're not trying to kill nature, we're trying to understand it. So victory over nature and over publishing nature means some credible epistemology, a way that we do scientific work that the community agrees upon and enforces through its norms. And that credible epistemology has been for a long time, although we don't know always how to enact it, some comprehensively engineered and reported scientific literature, right? Where we can, scientific results are reported in enough detail that other people, your colleagues, can make up their own minds about the quality of your work. You don't have to be trusted. Yeah. And that's the only real sense that Karl Popper ever meant by testable, the intersubjective validity of scientific work. It means that we are trained and able to justify and reliably build ethical research programs. I'm not going to go into, I'll go a little bit into detail about that in some later slides. That scientific analyses are reported in with sufficient logic and clarity that other people can understand the logical flow from your question to your research design to the final results, which I want to say right now in the status quo is not that, right? It's often extremely difficult to do that. One way to think about this is that we should all be reporting our research in the way we would like our colleagues to report it, right? With enough detail and transparency and structure that we can make up our own minds about it. And then turning to our responsibility towards the public, many of us, if not most of us, are publicly funded. This implies, in my opinion, a moral contract with the public where we owe them not necessarily a bunch of outreach because there are specialists for that, but integrity to our work and transparency so that we're trusted actors, right? We're above suspicion in just doing careerist things, which I think is a persistent problem in the sciences, is the careerist incentives can dominate integrity. Okay, let me pivot a little bit with all that. That's kind of my prologue. Why doesn't the direct assault work? I want to talk about that idea, right? So I've given you this idea that nature, the phenomenon of nature, not the journal, is this overpowering army, and we need to be very scientific about where we insert the bayonet if we hope to understand anything about it. But often governments or mega governments like the EU like the idea of just throwing more money and people at a problem, right? So this is like what I call the Manhattan Project idea. The Manhattan Project, those of you who don't know, was this project that started during World War II, but continued for some time in various forms, where the United States threw a bunch of money and the world's best physicists at making atomic bombs and succeeded. And that idea often comes up in people's heads like, oh, there's this really important scientific problem. How does the brain work, for example? That's what I'm going to talk about first. We should throw more money and people at it. And I think the sorts of scientific problems that are easily solved that way are small in number, or you need to be at exactly the right point in the cumulative science of that field for throwing more money at it to actually produce usable applications. So there was this thing in the EU, which is basically become a long-running joke now. I apologize, people who have been involved in this or know people in it. Lots of great sub-projects came out of this, but the money could have been better spent. This ERC-funded project, or EU-funded project rather, the Human Brain Project, which was this attempt by the EU to compete with American science. It was a politically loved project, throwing tons of money and research groups at simulating a human brain. In peer review, all the peer reviewers were like, "We don't know how to do this. This is not the time to do this." Let me give away, spoiler alert, it didn't work, right? So we didn't simulate a human brain, not even close. Sure, there was some good research that got done under the umbrella of the Human Brain Project, but that research could have been funded in more efficient ways, is the argument. So just very quickly, although I could do an hour talk just about the Human Brain Project, it would be fun. Lots of money, many years, and ramp up. From the very beginning, there were conflicts among the scientists about the achievability of the results. And now all the articles written about it are like, why did we do this? So let me recap. From the very beginning of the proposal, most brain scientists were like, we're not ready to do this. It's not going to work. But the EU politicians wanted to throw more money at it, and they really wanted this thing to work. And not a surprise, it didn't work. There are other cases of this as well. I don't want to pick on neuroscience. I'm actually a big fan of neuroscience, which is why I know this example better. Particle physics is a case you may have heard of too, where the colliders, despite the fanfare for various things like the Higgs boson, the colliders have mainly been failures. The reasons that they were built, it turns out there weren't advances in those areas. New physics was not discovered. And now there's been this proposal for even bigger collider, and this has led to this running joke among in the physics community that please, bro, just one more collider, please, one more collider, and like a drug addict who's addicted to colliders. And but these things become increasingly expensive as they get bigger and bigger, and it's not clear exactly what science they're supposed to produce. But the idea of conquering nature by throwing an overwhelming force against it is very appealing to some people. But lots of physicists have turned against this now. And the last I heard from a physicist colleague, this is not going to get funded, or at least it looks unlikely. Particle physics will go on, though. I'm very hopeful for it, but not this way necessarily. So I could go on other examples in biology and in the social sciences and so on, but it's not the point. Is that the commonality among these things is that we need some smarter way of working between theory development and measurement that makes better use of the human capital we have at our disposal. So I say smarter, not harder. And for those of us who work in small groups, don't have tons of resources, and that's most scientists in most fields, you're not going to get the budget to build a new collider. You're not going to get the budget to do simulate brains. You need to make incremental improvements where your expertise lies, and you want to do it in a valid and reliable way. And that's where I want to focus my attention. And I think most of the really important advances in the sciences in most fields have come from that kind of work instead, not from the massively funded sorts of things. It's the principled people doing an ordered and logically derived series of experiments to understand a phenomenon have made most of the important advances in the sciences and in applied mathematics as well. These big science boondoggles are politically appealing to politicians who are somehow isolated from how science actually works, and they're not going away. But I want to support people who are working in small teams where the really exciting new stuff is going to come from, I think. And I have a lot of critique here about attempts to do versions of big science under the umbrella of the open science movement, which I've participated in all these sorts of things. So I'm criticizing some of my own past enthusiasm here. Among these things are these big cross-team collaborations, which have value, but they're often very poorly rationalized. Things like multiverse analyses and massive meta-analyses, where the analyses just don't make logical sense. They're comparing studies which have fundamentally different measurements, which are improperly standardized. Multiverse analyses in particular contain a bunch of models which are just illogical. I'm not sure what we learn about robustness from fitting models that make no scientific sense, and so on. I'd be happy to answer more questions about this in the Q&A. Scientific projects often contain routine data processing errors. I'm a methodologist. I spend a lot of time focusing on reliable workflows with my students and with my colleagues. I try to produce them myself. And for those of you who do this sort of work, what you know is that you're writing a bunch of tests constantly. Every little step gets a test. It's test-driven scientific workflow. And we make mistakes all the time. Even those of us who've been doing this for decades now, we still make mistakes. Mistakes happen to the best of us. But lots of analyses get published without such checks, and then the analysis ends up being wrong because in the supplemental, someone finds, oh, this line was just, there was a typo and this was wrong, and now all the results are wrong, and we have to fix the data. We all make mistakes. So when that happens, these are innocent mistakes. That's fine. But we'd like to prevent these things from getting into the literature because probably most of those mistakes are not found. And we don't have the peer review human capital to go through all the open materials, even once we have them. Most scientific data analyses or projects, and I have something in mind that's bigger than just statistics here. If you bear with me, I'll get to it in a couple slides. There's no testing and no proofs of any kind. So the logical justification for the data processing pipeline is just completely absent. And often there's just justification by results. Look at these results, aren't they cool? And that seems to justify the methods. All right, that's enough of Grumpy Richard. Let me try to well, I guess I'm not over. There's one more example here. So The other thing, sort of the overwhelming force approach to conquering nature, would be we just need more data. And this is very big, not just in academia, but also in private research. The idea of doing big data science, having really big data sets with lots of automated data capture, and then using all of these data to figure out what's going on. Now, statisticians have never thought this sounded very credible. And I think maybe the scientists are coming around to it too. The short version of the argument would be that in the real world, there's a trade-off between the size of data sets and the quality of the data for any particular question. Large data sets often have systematic biases in them that make it impossible to accurately recover causes. And I put as a citation on this slide, the citation's at the bottom, this Bradley et al. 2021 paper on unrepresentative big surveys and trying to estimate vaccine uptake. That's just one example, but as I said, in statistics, there's a whole technical literature about this problem and the problems of big data sets and how they're often not representative of the phenomena we want to estimate. So it's not something that goes away. Those kinds of structural biases in data don't go away with bigger data sets. They often get more magnified. So again, throwing more money at the problem, just bigger and bigger data sets, I do not think is the general answer, even if it works in some cases. Now, let me try another metaphor on you, what I'm trying to aim at here. There are lots of problems in the reliability of scientific literature, problems in peer review, problems in publication bias, problems in research design, and so on. And I think one of the things about the open science movement, which I'm definitely a participant in, and I've been involved in for 20 years now, I guess, is that making things open makes it easier to discover mistakes, right? When you have the materials, it's like, I don't know about the rest of you, but for me, it's like a whole different experience when I've got a paper and I've got the materials, the amount that I can learn from the paper. Going through the data and replicating their graphs and really understanding what they did. Sometimes you find mistakes, but a lot of time it just helps you really interrogate what happened and understand better and build directly upon their data and code. It's a huge advance. But that said, there's a lot of pollution that enters the journals because scientists are still working in often error-prone ways. Because they haven't been taught to work in other ways. They have poor statistical training. They're not taught good ways of doing code. They're not taught ways, as I'll comment in a little bit, to actually logically integrate their scientific questions with how they do data processing. And the open science movement, in a sense, is trying to clean up the pollution after it's gotten into the atmosphere. Right. So this is the analogy from this slide is it's like trying to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere after we've emitted it. And you can do this. Norway has a big air scrubbing plant now, and companies and nations can pay money to Norway to sequester CO2 for them, and Norway will bury it under the ocean for millennia. You can absolutely do that. The physics checks out. But this is very inefficient compared to just not emitting it in the first place. Right? It's like stopping pollution at the source is always a better strategy than trying to clean the pollution out of the resource. And I think this goes for the scientific literature as well. And we should work on all ends of this. It's not one or the other, just like with CO2 removal. We have to work at all sides of this problem. But reducing the emission of garbage into the scientific literature is going to have a bigger impact, I think. And that requires training and tool development and some of the other things I want to talk about. Okay, I am conscious of the time, and I'm going to leave some time for discussion, I promise. All right. So the open science, I want to talk about the open science movement. I think another thing about the open science movement that I've increasingly noticed is that it generates more paperwork for people. And constrains people's freedom. And this has led to some backlash. And now maybe that's just a backlash that we've got to grow out of. I don't know, but I'm sympathetic that most of this additional paperwork or these things that have to do with transparency don't in and of themselves do very much to improve the quality of scientific research. They may make it harder to do fraud, and that's good. I think there is a lot more fraud than people realize, but that's another lecture. But things like pre-registration Pre-registration, as I understand it, coming out of, say, psychology and parts of biology, is there to stop people from p-hacking. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their statistical analysis is better. It stopped them from cheating, but the quality of the research may still be quite low. Registered reports, you can register a bad research plan. Yeah, and people won't notice. I've peer reviewed a bunch of registered reports, and often they're shockingly bad. To be honest, again, I'm a statistician, so um, we're annoying. I understand that. Open materials, I'm a big fan of this. I think that absolutely needs to exist, and we need a collective solution for storing all this stuff. But open junk is still junk, and we're going to exhaust the pool of human capital and peer review if this stuff is not machine checkable in some way. This is a critical issue for us. And I think the open access movement, this is a broader discussion, but I'm sure the PCI folks have spicy opinions about this. The open access movement has been largely captured by for-profit publishers, I think. And this is a big issue where, Diamond open access is an escape hatch, perhaps, but that we should all be trying to support. But this has been very demoralizing for me as someone who got interested in publication reform 20 years ago. It's been quite depressing how maneuverable and strategic the for-profit publishers have been in corrupting our goodwill. Anyways, I just wanted to put that in there. Anyway, this is all about stopping pollution at the source, right? Is the way I want to say. Okay, let me pivot to the more logical part of the presentation. And so I want to highlight two different kinds of errors. I just spent all this time complaining about errors in the scientific literature. There's different kinds of errors. I just want to highlight two different ones. On the left, this is one I mentioned before, they're procedural errors, innocent mistakes. So we have an intent to carry out the analysis in a particular way. It could be the ideal, logically derived way to analyze data, but we just make a mistake. Sometimes those mistakes arise because people are using tools like Excel, which were not really designed, well, let's say they were not designed in any way for doing scientific research, and they're prone to error just because of how they are. And so there was this famous paper in economics by a couple of Harvard economists, Reinhardt and Rogoff, published this paper in 2010, where there was an Excel formula error. They just didn't drag the formula down all the way and include all the countries. And then a graduate student, Herndon, there discovered this error and published a paper in 2013 showing the mistake. So that was an innocent error. They shared the materials with Herndon. They weren't trying to cover anything up. They made a mistake, and we could probably argue that using Excel to do data analysis is like pipetting by mouth. For the biologists who work in labs, you know what pipetting by mouth is. For the rest of you, you have no idea what I'm saying. But basically, laboratory protocols, it took a while for laboratory safety and good laboratory protocols to evolve culturally. And people used to do shockingly dumb things in the previous century in laboratories. They probably still do, but it's better than it used to be. Data analysis and the rest of science is often quite clunky like that. We're still using tools which are just not safe for the business. But these are procedural errors. They don't arise from any deeper logical problem. It's just a goof up. The other kind of error on the right-hand side of this slide is something that I think is equally common, at least equally common. It's not rare, but much more difficult to address. And it's the lack of a logical procedure in the data analysis or the science in the first place. And the example I give you here is from Cell Biology, this paper from Singer and Pachter, where they talk about the problem. They're not the ones who did it, but hundreds of cell biology papers have been studying methylation and doing calculations the wrong way and producing systematically biased estimates as a result. And the reason is because there's a data analysis procedure, as often happens in biology. It's invented by some big lab or one of these institutes, and they write a package for it. But there's no mathematical derivation of the procedure. There's no logic to it at all, but it gets copied over and over and over again. And then eventually someone asks, like, oh, what's the justification for this? And then they discover it's a bad procedure, but 100 papers later. There's a lot of this stuff that goes on in the sciences, and sometimes it's not hundreds of papers, sometimes it's just one paper, but still it's the same common issue, is that there's not a logical connection between the question and the way the data are analyzed. And I think this is a critical area for the Guerrilla approach, where it is possible for small researchers with very few resources to do this, to logically derive how they analyze their data. It's within your abilities. You don't need superpowers to do it. It's really a question about the integration of your scientific questions and your scientific models of the world. And there are lots of ways that data are analyzed in the sciences under the status quo. Some are worse than others. The worst, of course, is what I'd call regression storytelling. So the general thing about data analysis is that, and if you take a stats course, it's like the draw the owl meme that I have on the slide here. You're taught how to draw the ovals. So that's step one. And then the rest of your scientific project is draw the rest of the owl, however you can, right? But you're taught t-tests, which is the first two ovals. And then the rest of it is like, well, how do I integrate these things with my scientific question? And how do I design the measurements? And how do I deal with all this other stuff that I'm told I need to deal with? And then the reviewers want me to do X, Y, and Z. And maybe they're right, and so on. So this is the full scientific workflow. It's just the target of our attention today. And regression storytelling is this way of working where you have measurements which are metaphorically related to the scientific question at hand. They're obviously somehow part of the phenomenon, but there's not any logical design connection. This is often true in population biology and the social sciences, for example. I think you'll recognize this version of work. And then you run a bunch of multiple regressions and you interpret every beta coefficient as a causal effect of that variable, and you have a discussion section which discusses this. This is a very dominant mode of data analysis in the sciences, and it can work, but there's no logical coherence to it at all in terms of connections. It's a way of turning data into stories. There's the big if true way of data analysis, often seen in journals like Nature, where there's persuasion by consequences, right? So we analyze the data in a particular way. Maybe it's ad hoc, but look at these results. If this is right, it's a big deal. And now, don't get me wrong, I think there's a place for that kind of stuff in the sciences. But we need to understand the logical flow and not exaggerate its power. Heuristic workflow is something that sounds good, and that's also a form of illogical workflow. There are a bunch of papers where, like in the example from Singer and Pachter, the 2015 paper, the original authors who came up with this way of analyzing DNA methylation, their justification for the method was it made sense to them. It was just an intuition, and then they programmed it, but they didn't check its logic, and it turns out not to work. There's inductive workflows and deductive workflows, and I won't say much more about those right now, but I have some slides later about those. I think both of those have their strengths and weaknesses as well. If you've heard about the causal revolution, then you understand the direction I'm coming from here. This is something I talk about a lot in my book, Statistical Rethinking. So, for example, population biology is going through its encounter with the causal revolution now, where there's this rethinking of the dominant methods in population biology and ecology, and they're realizing that there are thousands of papers which are simply illogical because they have used regression models in a way that doesn't make sense for causal inference. And that's not an understatement. It really is that serious. What do I mean when I say the causal revolution? Well, I mean this revolution in statistics, which really got underway in the 1980s, as recently as the 1980s, in which it became possible to deduce the statistical analyses that are appropriate to particular scientific questions, given some minimal set of assumptions about the natural system you're studying. That is, it makes scientific data analysis have the same logical status as a mathematical proof, which doesn't guarantee that your result is correct, but at least it tells you that you can justify the form of data analysis or reject some form of data analysis given a precise minimal list of assumptions. What are the minimal assumptions which will make your study correct? And that's a victory. And this is something that's only been around since the 80s, even though the roots of it go back to the 30s with Sewell Wright, really the 20s with Sewell Wright and path analysis. But it was really only in the 1980s that it started to really develop. And so papers like this famous paper, Geiger et al. From 1990, where I won't go into the details of this, but what I want to say about this is The 90s were already a while ago, but this stuff is just getting into the sciences, right? So there are software packages that integrate these algorithms for causal discovery and causal validity checking into statistical packages now. It's seeping in, but every field's at a different stage of this. And the nice thing is these tools are free. They cost you nothing. In a week, you can learn how to use them. Right. This is the kind of stuff that guerrilla warriors need. And it makes a huge difference in your sense of confidence about your work and also what your peers can understand about your work, because your statistical analyses are derived from a small set of scientific assumptions that you can list. And that's a real victory. So what can you do? Right. That's the idea. The goal is we want to help researchers work with scientific models, questions, statistical models at the same time, not have statistical analysis be some separate thing, which is not logically integrated with the questions we're asking about a natural system and our assumptions about that system. That is the hypotheses or the mechanistic models of that system. And these things exist. This is not science fiction. As I said, since the 80s, there has been a causal revolution going on in statistics that made this stuff available. It's really that new. It gives you the ability to derive statistical procedures from mechanistic models. That's what I mean by generative on this slide, a mechanistic model of the system you study, and some formal scientific question about it, which is unambiguous. This reveals the assumptions that are necessary for your inference to be true. So that means your colleagues could say they don't really like that assumption, or they want to know what happens when you relax it. Those are perfectly good questions. But that's an advance, is having that transparency and comprehensibility. And then to help researchers generalize appropriately, because when you make a prediction, that's yet another thing that you do with scientific inference, and you need to understand how generalization works as well in a transparent way. And what we really need to integrate all this, though, which doesn't exist, is what I'd call a comprehensive theory of scientific workflow that's on the same mature status as, say, proof theory in mathematics, which is a whole other story of something that took centuries to evolve, right? But I think in the sciences, where only since the 1980s has there been serious work on a scientific theory of workflow, by which I mean the formal integration, the logical integration of scientific questions, our theoretical models about the world, about nature, and the ways that we analyze data, and have those be part of the same system that we study together. So what do I mean by scientific workflow? I mean, two kinds of workflows. There's the dynamic workflow, which is what you actually did, which involves lots of zigzagging and second guessing and revising your model of the world and revising your stat model and collecting more data. That's what I'd call dynamic workflow. And we need assistance for that as well. But I'm mainly talking about logical workflow, which is the logical justification for the sets of assumptions which can logically justify how you analyze the data and permit causal interpretation of the results you get out of it. That's what I call scientific workflow. And this would then make the checking of a scientific project basically a logical exercise. I want to talk about the Choose Your Own Adventure book cover, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to keep moving. Sorry. Statistical workflow is narrower in this. So I work on statistical workflow, and I just finished a book with some of my colleagues, Andrew Gelman and Aki Vetteri for the most part, but also our other co-authors who are listed here on the cover. It comes out this month, and this is about statistical workflow for Bayesians, and non-Bayesians will also get something out of this book, but there's lots of Bayes stuff in there. So you if you're not Bayesian, you're not going to like a whole chapter on priors, for example. But the point of this book is to have systematic and logical, theoretically derived diagnostics for every step of statistical workflows that we do, thinking of modern computational statistics. But this work is narrow in the sense that it's bounded on both ends. On the leading end, it's bounded by it doesn't yet seriously engage with scientific questions and mechanistic models of nature. There's a lot in the middle about statistical models and how to work with them and validate them and test them and revise them and even build them. But what they're for is more of a murky scientific project. And then on the other end, the reporting side, we need statistical summaries that make sense in light of the scientific questions. And that's another failure mode, is that a coefficient is often not an answer to what's the causal effect. Think about some complicated situation like a vaccination campaign. When you vaccinate some proportion of the population, there are spillover effects through herd immunity. And so the causal effect of vaccinating people in a particular age group is a very complicated thing to calculate. You need a complicated simulation or mathematical derivation to do it. It's not just a coefficient from a model, if that makes sense. And I think lots of important things in science are of that type too. So none of those hard parts are in this book, unfortunately, but the middle part we've made some progress on. Just want to say, I'm always setting new problems for myself. So the Guerrilla workflow thing, what are the principles for you, the lone researcher? And I often think of PhD students, my junior colleagues who are often called postdocs here in my system. What are the principles? You divide and conquer. You want to do analytical decomposition of your scientific project. I'm going to say some more about this on the next slide. We have explicit goals and assumptions for the analysis. These are things you would demand from your colleagues as well, but the idea is to teach junior researchers how to do them themselves. There's comprehensibility, that is transparent reasons for each step, the ways that questions are integrated with models to produce statistical analyses, for example. That's the diagram on the right of this slide. We can start at the top with a precise question and some generative model of the system. And then the statistical model is actually a logical consequence of those assumptions. You have no freedom to choose which regression you use. If you make assumptions higher up, it forces you to a logical conclusion there. And that's the idea, is having the scientific version of this instead of slinging models against nature until something sticks. And then quality assurance. Everything needs to be tested, and working in a way where you're using simple scripting. This has been a great thing about the revolution in scripting in the biological sciences and the social sciences, I think, is to give power to poorly funded researchers to do really good quality assurance of their work through simulation testing. That's a very important thing. And I'm not going to teach you how to do that today, but I do teach that. My book, Statistical Rethinking, really focuses on that. So let me think about this a little bit more, and I'm conscious of the time. I won't even take 10 more minutes here, but that we start from the top of the set of assumptions about our question. That is, we're very clear about what we're trying to estimate. A set of assumptions, just the ones we're willing to make about the mechanistic system that we're studying. And those things then force, and there are software packages that will do this for you, force a way of analyzing it, tell you what is a logically justifiable way of getting a statistical estimate, which has the meaning that is an answer to your precise question. And we combine that statistical model with some data to get estimates, and then we want to report summaries that make sense in light of the precise question as well. And this is what I think of as the minimal guerrilla scientific workflow that has these this decomposition, these logical steps, and this is already supported by software packages in all the major scripting languages. There's a nice little slim textbook which came out this year, the Data Analyst Guide to Cause and Effect, which teaches this whole thing. It's very simple. You need very little statistics. This isn't about statistics. It's about scientific workflow. They have this nice linguistic innovation. They say science is easy, triple ESI, which stands for estimand, estimator, estimate, and simulation-based inference. The idea here, they show in a bunch of examples in this thin book, it's not even 200 pages, how to do modern scientific workflow with tools that are freely available to you, where you can catch mistakes and have a logical progression from questions to statistical design to the reporting of your estimates. It's a really nice book. I really recommend it. It's better than my book. It's like the condensed version of my book with a lot fewer silly examples. I very much recommend it. I think it's out already. I say available October this year, but I've seen a physical copy, so I know it exists. I'm gonna I'll say I was gonna skip this. I say in my real work, I apply this stuff, and I've gotten interested in this because of how hard some of the problems I work on are. I have this ongoing collaboration with some UNESCO fisheries biologists to try and predict where fish are going to go under global warming. And this involves estimating biological features of individual fish species from highly imbalanced and imperfect data. It's combined with satellite sensing data about ocean temperatures and currents. And then there's climate models and there's biological models of fish schooling and a bunch of things. It's a really complicated sort of project, exactly the kind of project where the overwhelming complexity of nature is incredibly intimidating, and a mistake in any place can just trickle through and cause lots of problems downstream. So we have this whole scientific workflow thing in the team, in the group, where we're going through all of these decomposed steps and testing each of them, and then we combine data and develop the models and test them on simulations and so on through to the end. I'm not going to go through this with you because I want to stop in a couple minutes here and hear what you have to say, but just say that I'm trying to practice what I preach here and develop tools and software tools in the context of these collaborations then that I can give away to the community, so you can use them in your own projects. But it's really about the transparency and comprehensibility and quality assurance. It's like the engineering of quality science aimed at reporting standards that in publications about this, diagrams like this one and the code that's associated with each of the nodes would be easily available to you as a reviewer. And then you could build your applications and models directly on top of those sorts of things. I've written a couple of papers about this topic as well. Here's one that I wrote with some of my anthropology colleagues, a computational workflow for studying questions in cultural evolution, which goes through fully coded examples of doing these kinds of things for particular questions about cultural learning, which is a topic that's very interesting to me. I was told that I should say something about AI by a colleague, and so I'm going to say something about AI. For those of you who don't want to hear about AI, just close your ears for a minute. but I think there's something to say about AI because one of the things people will say to me when I say I'm working on workflow is they're like, "Well, why work on that? AI is just going to do all the workflow for scientists in the future." And maybe that's true in some sense, but the way AI does work, it can help you build tools. It needs direction and it needs all the redundancies and modular structure, which I've laid out for you in the previous slides. And this already exists. If those of you who use Anthropic's Claude at all or have heard of it, when Claude works on complicated problems now, it spawns a bunch of Claudes, copies of itself that work on subproblems, and it builds in redundancy and error checking. And it does this because, as you know, large language models are stochastic and they cannot guarantee in any particular instantiation that they do well. And so the people who have designed Claude have used Claude as its own check. And Claude spawns all of these networks, structured networks for workflow. And beyond that, you can give it a workflow. And so it will do redundancy checks of the kind you like. So I'm very hopeful that that will mature into something that can assist. But AI is going to need answers to all these questions and all of the theorems about the logical connections between scientific questions and stat models anyway, just to do things correct. So it's not like AI solves all the problems for us, even if it might help us. That said, I think you can do all this work without it. I really do. Okay, final slide, I promise. What can you take home from this? What are the Guerrilla actions? For researchers, you want to skill up a little bit and get familiar with the causal revolution. There are a bunch of textbooks to help you with this now. I mentioned the Data Analysis Guide to Cause and Effect, the short book. There's my book, Statistical Rethinking, and many hours of free lectures on YouTube of me trying to teach it to you. It's all free, made with love, and help you do logical, transparent, and quality assured research, which will make you feel better about your research, make you less insecure about it. Some insecurity is optimal, so I don't want to get rid of all of it, but it'll make you feel less insecure about it. And it'll make your research more comprehensible to your colleagues as well. For publishers, I would say that having replication data sets and materials that are up to that standard is a great goal, and I'm a huge supporter of that. But what's often missing from from raw replication are the justifications. Justifications for the structure of the data analysis plan is extra information that helps us do peer review on it. And it's that logical layer of what assumptions about in the mechanistic model lead you to think that this is the right statistical method. That kind of thing is nearly always missing in my experience. For funders, this is a much more open area because, of course, the funding landscape is extremely dynamic, just like publishing is. But for funders, they're being inundated with just way too much workload and review. And I think having structured scientific workflows as part of projects reduces the burden of peer review. It makes it possible to say whether proposals have any hope of logically answering what they're asking for money to do. And that makes peer review more efficient and makes science better. And for educators like myself, I think of myself primarily as an educator these days because I have a permanent job and I should pay that forward. We need to be teaching scientific workflow and developing the tools to make it possible for junior researchers to really do this and make contributions at any stage of their careers, even with meager resources. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to turn off my slides and try to read some questions now.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much for your presentation. We now take some questions from the audience. So
there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Here. So we will probably stop at a 5:15. So we have 15 minutes for the questions.
Okay.
If we want to make more, we can. And if you have questions, you just write it in the chat. So, Richard, if you are able to read the chat, and if you are
I'm scrolling.
So, yes, there are some comments. Maybe the comments are not worth.
Yeah. I see James Steele made this comment. I meant to say this about the denial of peer review attack, DOPRA, which is some slang that I would like to spread. It comes from Lior Pachter. These 100-page supplementals are so hard to review that Lior thinks it's often strategically complicated, right? Because it makes it impossible to review the paper. I think the first question here from Cindy Morris is the underlying reason for the failure of these big projects a question of leadership than something inherent to mega projects? In other words, maybe leadership is focused on the glory of success, the humbleness of drudgery of doing good science. That's a good question, Cindy. I don't know. I mean, leadership and project structure is incredibly important. So I don't want to say that isn't a contributing factor. That might be part of it. That might be one of the reasons for the failure. Yeah, it distracts from that. But I don't know. That's a good question. I should think about that more. I know people have thought about that more. As a methodologist, I always focus on the logic of it and whether the methods are logical or not. But yeah, maybe they're illogical because of the incentive structure of the leadership of these big projects. Cindy had another question. In a world we can does indeed present a credible epistemology, does that mean that we would not need peer review? I don't think so. Some others commented along. I think it changes how peer review works. So the question, if I may rephrase, is in my science fiction utopia of science, where people are applying this easy framework, where we're using these modern tools to logically justify or at least transparently report the assumptions that are required for our analysis to work. Does peer review become unnecessary? I don't think it does, but it does change. You still need to validate that all the validation steps were done, and you need to do peer review on the minimal assumptions. And often there will be alternative ways of doing work which could be better, even if the thing that's being reported is correct and logically justifiable. There could be something better. So peer review has a big role there as well. But it would transform. So the analogy would be, when I was at that conference in London last summer for the future of scientific publishing, there was an editor from a mathematics journal there, and his comments about how mathematics peer review works are very interesting to me. Because, of course, they're doing proofs and they're reviewing proofs. And a lot of proofs in mathematics are machine assisted now because proofs have gotten really big. And they have this programming language called Lean. Some of you may have heard of this, where people write proofs in socially. And Lean has a proof checker in it, so it can check. The machine can check whether the proof that has been written makes sense logically, and that's a huge thing. So I'm saying I'm aiming towards a small version of that, not automated checking, but at least the transparent labeling of assumptions that you believe justify your data analysis plan, and the tools to help you to verify that that's correct. So it's a little bit towards that direction. Lean is very mature, and the math community is way ahead of us because they had their version of this revolution around the year 1900. It's taken them 100 years to develop all the tools to support it. We'll go faster this time, right, for the rest of science, but hopefully. But peer review is still incredibly important in mathematics because people go through the proofs and they talk about issues that can't be checked automatically. Someone still has to go through the proof and talk about the redundancy and what the minimal things are. And there are multiple ways to prove theorems. Absolutely. And there are still things that don't get caught, I'm told, in Lean. Terry Tao, who's I think the most famous living mathematician right now, is at UCLA, has a YouTube channel where he teaches you how to use Lean to do automated proofs. And I think it's extremely interesting because he talks about the sociology of it and the team features of it and the different roles also for AI assistance. Even though there's this language which automatically checks the proofs, what can AI actually do for mathematicians? Which I should say, if you've heard people talk about AI doing math and replacing mathematicians, AI uses Lean, right? So there's this system that mathematicians wrote which has all the theorems in it so that you can validate the AI's proof is correct. And that's what's making the AI powerful. It's Lean that's doing it, which I think is a very interesting thing, like where the power comes from. Sorry, I could say lots about that. I'm a bit long-winded with these answers. I'll try to be briefer. Denny said the larger the data set is, the more errors it tends to contain, indeed, but the more data there is, the more robust the conclusions can be. I think that depends upon the structural biases that are present in the measurement. And bigger data sets often are unrepresentative of the population, which sounds ironic, but small randomly sampled data sets are the gold standard, where they can be representative of complex phenomena. The bigger data sets are often convenience data sets that are collected administratively, and they have biases in data collection. So like Facebook data sets are famous for this. And since they're biased, the size just makes you more confident in the wrong conclusion. I think this is a really big issue with big data sets of that kind. But it is subtle. There are certainly cases where more data is better, but the 1 over square root of n law tells us in stats that we don't need that much data in a randomly sampled data set. So it's unclear what the really giant data sets are for. I'm going to skip over a little bit of this in the interest of getting through to some of the others. Nuno asks, I actually believe pre-registration helps improve experimental design, filling in the number of fields about hypotheses, methods, blinding, statistical tests. That's a great comment, Nuno. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'd acknowledge that. The task of making people actually have the full fill in all those blanks, as you say, really can help designs. Absolutely. What's missing there is the checkable logical workflow of all those things, right? Is to do something more. People can just fill in the boxes however they like. But I grant your point. I should have been more careful with my comments. Zoltan says PCI shows how to do open access. Yeah, I tend to agree. I think PCI is a great initiative. No one knows what the future of publishing will be like, but hopefully it's more like PCI than like Springer. And about registered reports, Thomas, you said you peer reviewed for very bad registered reports. This is disappointing registered reports. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Yeah, that's reasonable. I'm going to resist the urge to. Someone noticed kitty parkour. Yeah, my cat invaded my desk multiple times during my talk. I apologize. He cannot be governed. James writes a long comment question. Sounds plausible. It's supposed to be in response to Nuno's comment. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Sorry, James. I think you guys are having great conversations in the comments, and I'll read these later. I'm not sure I have much to add there. Uh, how to stop the pollution at its source? Yeah, very quickly on that, I'm thinking it's stopping pollution at its source is if we could stop illogical estimators, that would be a huge victory. I think there are a lot of them in the sciences, these ways of analyzing data which just have no logical hope of addressing the scientific goals of the scientists who are using it. I'm a biologist for the most part, so I see them in biology as well, but also in the social sciences. There's lots of data analyses which condition on post-treatment variables, and that's extremely dangerous. Now, there's a whole section of my book where I talk about this problem, so I won't go into it, but that's, you know, huge fraction of experiments in political science are messing up the randomized experiment by putting in variables downstream of treatment, and then they're getting the wrong estimates for the experiment they designed. And I think if we could just stop people from doing that, that would be a huge dividend for published science. So that's what I mean by stopping pollution at the source. Other things matter as well. We should stop pollution everywhere. Um, uh, yeah, some more comments, Sandy. Perhaps we need to be teaching logic. I'm all for that, but I'm a quant, so don't let me design the curriculum. I'm just gonna make my comments and build tools and see what people take up. But I think logic is good, but other people disagree with me. Um, uh, Denny says, I think many of us criticism the way science conducted and published and agree, and therefore. Um, the issue often seems to lie in the forces that sustain the status quo. Yeah, that's thanks for that comment. I didn't talk much about the overall incentive structures, even though that's probably the most important thing is reforming incentive structures in the sciences and the institutions and how promotion is done and how evaluations are done and so on. I agree that's the elephant in the room, as we say. I just designed this talk to be focused on the helpless PhD student who sees these problems and wants to do better, but has no power. I mean, I'm a Max Planck director. It's my job to participate in institutional reform, and I do that as well. I'm a member of a Max Planck Society has a working group for open science that I'm a member of, and we really want to do something. And the Max Planck Society has really drug its feet on this. So, I feel like we should really be better about it. But the lone PhD student can get demoralized because they feel like there's nothing they can do. And the message I want to take home for here is that there are things you can do. There is this framework for stopping pollution at the source. You can do less pollution, and you can use the same framework to interrogate the papers you read and ask, should I believe this? Is there a logical justification for the data analysis? The assumptions they make, should they have included these controls or not? That's within your power now as a lone researcher to interrogate, and I think there's progress to come from stuff like that. It's cleaning up pollution at the source, stopping yourself from believing in false things, and producing work which doesn't encourage false beliefs in others. I think that's a positive message that doesn't require the full restructuring of institutions, even though we should do that. Yeah, I am a revolutionary. I don't hide it at all. Some more questions. Inez, I'm sorry, I don't know what your language is, but probably Inez Almeida asks, do you think this model of workflow should be applied to all fields of research and those in which reproducibility is more relevant? I think there's a version of scientific workflow to be applied in every field. I work with digital humanities scholars more and more these days, and so I'm not unfamiliar with qualitative analyses, and qualitative analyses also have workflow. I think there's stuff to do there too. I don't want to get rid of qualitative analysis. I'm an ethnographer. I'm an anthropologist. I did my PhD dissertation as in ethnography. So, but the workflow needs to be adapted, and the specific tools need to change. But everything should be transparent and logically justifiable, even for qualitative analysis. Yeah, that would be nice. It's different than political persuasion, where whatever works, right? Someone gave a link. Karina, hi Karina, gave a link. Karina Logan gave a link to the website for Data Analyst Guide to Cause and Effect. You should take a look at that link. And Chloe asks, logical workflow will have to be properly documented, so easily go from 100 to 200 supplemental pages. That's a great question, Chloe. So I have thoughts about that, and I'm running out of time here. But what I want to say is the structured workflow diagrams I showed are networks that code can be embedded in. And I'm writing an R package to do this now. And it actually makes it simpler because it makes it possible to browse the analysis in a networked way and get all the code that's associated with each transformation step in a graphical sense. It makes order out of the chaos is the idea. Now I'm still developing that. It's an active obsession with me, and so I don't have anything to share with you right now. But I'm very conscious of that problem of having even more complexity. But having things structured together, like what are the robustness checks of a main analysis? How do they differ? And being able to do quick comparisons that are structural, I think that's a doable thing. But it requires some tools to make things a little better. But it goes from the idea like, I mean, I think the publishing people know this even better than I do, but it's like we got the internet and then basically we just put PDFs on it, right? Like, what are we doing? All right. So it's like we're still living in the printing press, right? So the Gutenberg is a great invention. The printing press has been wonderful. We get the internet, and instead of transforming how publishing is done, we just use PDFs everywhere. And I think there's a lot of gains to be had by thinking about more dynamic ways of publishing that integrate the actual scientific materials with the reporting, and that should help tame some of the supplemental. So I have some ideas about that, and I'm actively working on code for that. So if I get to talk to you folks maybe next year, maybe I have some stuff I could demo for you if you're interested, or maybe I'll publish something in a PCI journal and we can talk about it.
Richard, we let you decide when you want to stop answering questions. So if
Okay.
you want to
I
stop
got a
now,
little bit
you
more time.
okay?
I'm happy to stay a little bit longer. There are lots of
Good.
questions and I'm scrolling but people should feel free to leave whenever you have lives and you have things to do and you know my opinions at this point. But Tom Stafford says, "What could funders require of applicants to allow comparable logical coherence checking of research plans?" Um, Thanks for that question. My cat wants to intervene here. So, sorry, everyone. This is my cat. He's very needy. Um, so the way I'm thinking of the minimal thing is to simply talk about have a justification layer for the statistical analysis in addition to simply a method section, right? So have some clear derivation of this is the question. We want to estimate the causal effect of this thing within this system. Our data analysis plan is to analyze it in the following way, and the assumptions which make that correct are X, Y, and Z. That's the kind of minimal thing. What's different from a typical method section in the sense that a typical method section is just a list of what was done. And I'm a statistical reviewer, so I read lots of. That's the first part of the paper I read. Right? I read the title, the abstract, and then I go to the methods. And method sections can be dense. They need to be. I understand that, but what's nearly always missing are the justifications. So from the funder reviewer side, it's even more important is to say, what is the logical justification for the plan here at a stage where they're planning data collection still. So you can make suggestions on the order of, well, you have to measure this other thing, or the way you're measuring that, or the way you plan to use it in the model is inappropriate. That kind of logical review. Now that requires reviewers. You might say that requires reviewers who know how to do this. But the goal in the medium run is to have some way of doing that planning and reporting, which is machine checkable, like mathematical proofs in Lean are. And I don't think it requires that data analysis be the same logical status as a mathematical proof. That's not my goal. But there can be logical flow represented as a network, so at least that the assumptions can be lined up in a way that makes peer review easier. The minimum would be, I would put it this way to you, Tom, is if you got to the method section of a big grant proposal and they had one of those network diagrams for their scientific project, which listed all of the steps and labeled them with the assumptions in each case, it would make your job as a reviewer much easier, right? Instead of reading the wall of text. And what we really want is the structure and not a paragraph, not the Gutenberg version of the statistical analysis. But something needs to be done there. Karina has some ideas about registered reports, which the registered reports people, in my experience, are way ahead on a lot of these things about reporting and structured reporting, right? Registered report people, stand up for yourselves. You've done a lot of good stuff in helping us understand that structured design and report is better than the just free form Gutenberg style things, and we should move towards more of that. Susanna asks, I teach first year undergrads, which of this should I teach them? That's a great question. I've thought about that too, because I don't teach first year undergrads, but I teach earlier university students here in Leipzig these methods as well as like a break off part of my bigger PhD level stats course. I think the most important thing is helping them understand the basic structural causal logic of what makes experiments work, is where I would start. Get them to understand, and this is the gateway into the causal revolution, is ask a scientist, why do we do randomized experiments? And they'll probably give you a wrong answer. Which, right, they'll say things like, oh, because it creates balance. No, that's not why it works. And randomizing the treatment works when it does for particular reasons that are revealed by the same structural causal logic that helps us design more complex statistical methods when we can't do randomized experiments, and also tells us why people sometimes ruin their randomized experiments by putting in post-treatment variables and the like. And then once you have that framework as a foundation, which involves like no stats at all, or minimal stats, you can just calculate averages and compare averages. So you don't have to talk about sampling theory or p-values or any of that stuff. Just do the basic structural causal logic. So Uta Pearl has this nice little book. It's a primer on causal analysis. It's a thin little book, which has almost no stats in it, and just. And I think that's something that any college student could learn to do. I don't think there's the perfect textbook for it yet. Pearl's book's good, but it's not ideal. It's because, he's a computer scientist, so he assumes you know a lot more math than the undergrads might. But the cartoon versions of just helping people understand structural causal models before they learn stats so that they use it effectively, I think that's doable as an education reform. And you could do a week of it in the context of a introductory statistics course as well. And again, really focused on why does randomizing treatment work? How does it remove confounding? But show it with structural diagrams. And then once they got that, it's a language that opens up talking about cases about when we can't randomize, how can we design a statistical solution which mimics randomization? It's like this, the statistical discovery of quasi experiments. But I would start with randomized experiments. I'm a biologist. I have biases in that regard. There's coverage of this in my stats book, but it's not for it's not for undergrads, I don't think, unfortunately. So someone, maybe me, should write this other book I'm imagining. People have suggestions here or asking this. Yeah. Oh yeah, Susanna talks to me. You've seen my stuff and you've read Uta Pearl too, so you know everything I'm going to teach you, Susanna. Other comments along those lines. Raphael asks, really interesting talk. Thank you. Could you expand a bit more on the divide and conquer analytical decomposition approach? We should approach research in a modular way, or something completely different. Yeah, I do mean like those workflow diagrams that I put up. That's what I mean by modular. You break it apart into steps and you test each step. So whenever, for example, you're combining a data set with a stat model, what you want to do is have some step in your code for testing that. And that could be logical, that you've got some logical mathematical proof that it's the right integration. But for data analysis, it's often going to be simulation. It's going to be like testing code. And so that's what I mean by modular, is that you're writing little checks for little modular bits of your code, and don't think about your workflow as like, we've all seen this, as these giant scripts that are like 2,000 lines long. And all the modules are somehow in there, but they're not separated out and they're not checked separately. Thinking about it more modularly and teaching people to develop in a modular way. And this also goes towards something I didn't mention in my talk, but that we talk about a lot in this Bayesian workflow book that I just finished with Gelman and Vettery, is for complex biological models, nobody can really develop them in one go without error. These models are way too complicated. The bioinformatics pipelines are complex. Those of you who do genomics works or cell biology work, you know what I mean. And so you need to modularize those and test the modules to have any confidence that the whole thing functions properly. And we also need to develop, now this is my job, develop ways for people to scaffold up to the target model that they want to use for the final analysis and not try to build it in one go, because the model itself has a bunch of modular pieces which can be pulled in and out. And each of those can be tested on its own as well. And there's a lot of complexity there, and it makes it all sound worse. But when we modularize and we have an order for developing the tests and integrating them, then it makes it all easier and increases your confidence in it. And again, this is not science fiction. You can do this sort of stuff. I do it in my work. The bioinformatics people at my institute do work that way. But they're specialists. And the idea is to take those cultural innovations and develop some tools to make it easier for every PhD student to be able to use that approach as well, because it'll make your work better. Yeah, to clean up some pollution at the source. That's the idea. And you can learn from examples, right? Is part of the idea. Okay, Blanca has a question: how much of this could be addressed simply by more rigorous guidance on and evaluation of pre-registration plans? I think I'm all for that. I think what that won't solve directly is there isn't the knowledge in the community of how to interrogate the logical coherence of scientific workflow. And again, I want to remind you that it's more than just the stats. It's the integration of the stats with the scientific goals and how the statistical results are reported. The beginning and the end are the scientific part, and the data processing is the middle part that we spend so much time on. So if reviewers don't know that framework, then they're not going to check it in the register report. And if the people writing the register report don't know that framework, then they can't write the necessary information into it. And so there's a lock and key kind of issue where we're educating up both sides of this problem at the same time. But again, all the tools exist. This is not science fiction. It is logically possible to derive a regression equation from a formal scientific question and a minimal set of assumptions about the natural system you're studying. And so it's doable. And there are software packages for automating it for you, but we need to integrate it in through a little bit of education. And yeah, thank you all for the thanks. I hope there was something useful there. Mel asked a question: as a PhD student, how can we learn all this workflow with the limited time and skills we have while having to deal with our PIs dragging us back at the same time? I feel like many of us know the problem and solutions, simply don't have time. I'm very sympathetic to that. This is a big kind of compression issue where every generation of scientists needs to know even more than the previous one. And over time, the problem solves itself. This doesn't help you right now, I understand, but over time it solves itself because education compresses those things. And we have tools that take some of that stuff out. So for example, it used to be even just a generation ago, when biologists took biostats, they spent months doing sums of squares for analysis of variance. That was a standard part of biology education. I went through that. And I like to think no one does this anymore because that all gets black boxed away into software, and you don't have to spend a lot of time on the arithmetic of it. And the sorts of models we use now, hierarchical models and Bayes is very big in the biological sciences, not so much in psychology, but in biology, it dominates different areas. And those models are sorts of things where you can't do the arithmetic, and we use simulation like Markov chains to get the results anyway. And that has opened up time in the curriculum and skill development for these other things, which are important. I think for your particular question, and this might sound a little flippant, but I mean it seriously, is that if you start with the causal material, it makes the other stuff easier because there's a bunch of stuff you just don't have to worry about. It simplifies the curriculum to a certain extent. And I believe that because that's the way I teach. And to the extent that my book has been successful, and it has been. I mean, I hope it just doesn't sound like bragging, but my stats book is extremely successful book, and I get lots of mail all the time about how transformative it has been in people's lives, and I appreciate that, and it keeps me working on the third edition, and but that my book takes this different order to the material, and that helps a lot as well. But I'm completely sympathetic to the problem, and I think what's going to happen. This doesn't help you right now necessarily, but what's going to happen in the medium term is that graduate curricula are going to be revised because institutes that want to get on board with the causal revolution are going to realize they have to teach this stuff, and then it won't be entirely your responsibility to do it extra. PIs like me are always a problem. I'm sorry. Like people in power exercise power, and that's the incentive question. And I don't want to ignore that issue because I think it's a serious one. But that's a longer conversation. I'd be happy to have another time. Lucas says, I feel this is a huge issue with brain studies. In cognitive neuroscience, so many studies simply consist of just putting a small group of people into the machine and see where the brain activates. What do results tell us about brain cognition? I'm collecting data on a novel project, but it feels a bit like we are doing it because it's novel and has potential. Obviously, when I think about it more deeply, it's a very rich and useful project, but there's a lot of little voice always telling me, why are you doing this? I'm sympathetic to this. I have collaborators here in Leipzig at the Cognitive and Brain Sciences Max Planck Institute in town, and I've seen a lot of this stuff, and we have these conversations all the time, actually. And I would say even in studies like this, to help you where you are, Lucas, you can try to be very specific about what it is exactly you're trying to learn from these novel measurements. I think exploration is a totally valid thing to do, and I think the statistics around data exploration is a serious branch of statistics. It's not like a joke sort of thing, but it's part of this workflow obsession of mine as well. Is you can be specific about just like a credible way to describe these new measurements for the brain or some particular task, then that's an achievement, right? It doesn't solve all the problems that may bother you about it or clean up the whole area of work, but it makes the quality and usability of your product better. And you can feel better about that, and then people can build on it better, or you can build on it better in the next study. So you can do these kind of marginal incremental improvements by being clear exactly about what it is you're trying to learn and what's a credible way to do it, and doing error checking at every part of the pipeline and so on. I've worked with voxels, and there's so much data treatment that goes on before you even get to the statistical model. There's lots of stuff there where you can do quality assurance and do the scientific workflow in a reasonable way and make good choices, and improve things a little bit in your area. Ariana asks, when and how does publication integrate into this scientific workflow? This is when to share which parts as results. When do we consider them to be final and shareable, especially for longer work that is not easily dividable in individual projects? That's a great question, and I don't have a single answer to that. I'll be honest. I try to think about a time in the future when scientific publication has versioning, right? So you don't have to think about the final version of stuff. You could publish incrementally in a project and have associated materials and reports, and then revise them, right? Like when you get more data, you could add it to the project and just update the results. And I'd love to see a future where we can do this, and communities like PCI, I'm sure, will be on the forefront of innovations like that in the coming years. But that's what I'd like to see, is something that goes around your immediate question, I'm sorry, by seeing some kind of different platforming where we see publication as an incremental record where there's explicit versioning. You can see this a bit on the archives now, right, where people do preprints and then there are new versions of the preprint. You could go back and see what changed. We could see that for analyses as well, and then you could do things incrementally. That's what I'd like to see, and that would be useful for peer review as well, because you could put up analysis plans and people could look at them and give you feedback on it, and then you could build on it. Um, but the sociological part, answer to your question, is people work in teams, and we're going to have to deal with incentive structure in teams to make good progress on this, right? So I think it's a persistent problem on all our minds is the issues of scientific credit and this PI model, which tends to assign too much credit to the first and last author, where big scientific projects these days are like movie productions, and everybody is essential to the product, but some of the pieces are just small. It's the person who changed the light bulbs or something, right? In the movie. And their alternative credit models are extremely important. And that's a much bigger problem, which has to do with changing the way evaluations are done and so on. But I don't have any, I mean, I advocate for changes like that within the Max Planck Society, but I don't have any real power over the whole system, obviously. But I think that's part of those questions about publishing, is when you get into issues of power and sharing credit, and those are real human problems that need to be solved politically. Yeah, and so I don't think there's a simple technical solution there. Um, but in the wonderful case in which you and say your best friend are working on a paper together and there's no conflicts of interest of that kind, um, then you can make some rational decision about the reporting and the updating of it using the technology available. And we just need better platforms to support those things. I think. I don't know if that sounds like an answer to you, but it's an honest one. I often think the broad questions, which are super important like that the details of each particular case often determine the solution. Yeah, and so it's hard in general to give a satisfactory answer. As a statistician, I'm sensitive to that because people often want me to tell them how to analyze their data without telling me very much about their project. And then it becomes an extended interview where I ask them and list things about the scientific background. All right, we can get to the end of this. Sorry, folks, if there's anybody left in the chat here. Connor asks, I'm a second year PhD student in psychology who wants to use what I've learned from your book in my work. When writing up our work for colleagues, how do we strike the balance between justifying analyses with our thinking while maintaining a paper that is readable? Yeah, that's a good question. I think sometimes these things are actually quite short. So if you're doing experimental psychology and you have randomized treatments, then there's no reason that the supplemental has to be super long. It can actually make it all easier to read if there's a logical flow, right? That you structure it like the network diagrams that I showed, the workflow diagrams, where you say, here's a question, here's a model of the psychological system. Sorry, I don't know social psychology very well. I've never had a psychology course in my life. Well, I should say I had one psychology course in college, and it was all about brains and neurons. It wasn't about behavior. It was about electrical potentials. So I'm a bit ignorant of your field. I apologize. But if you're doing randomized experiments, then the stats can be extremely simple. And you can justify them based upon the same causal logic, the tools from my book. Say that this is the experiment, here's the way to analyze it, these are the replicate units in the experiment, this is the right statistical model, I can validate it with simulated data. It becomes a structured supplement that's much easier to work through, and then your code base is actually a scaffold for somebody else or for future you. So I think it's an element, and not to brush off that there's work to do here, but a lot of open science behavior, or the behavior people like me encourage that has to do with science reform, is individually beneficial. Right? There's no conflict at the individual researcher level. There's conflict with institutions and what's rewarded. But for you as a second year PhD student who wanting to do the best work you can, when you put the time in to do the quality assurance and have a logical flow for the justification of your analysis, you save yourself time down the road because you get to reuse all that stuff. It's the hardest the first time you do it. But then in your next project, you get to start from your existing code base, and you're used to doing the quality assurance, and it just gets easier and easier. And now imagine a community where everybody's producing these things and they're part of the open materials. It just gets easier and easier to do. And it actually ends up saving time, I think. We're not there yet. I don't want to be flippant and say that, we're living in utopia yet, but it's the institutional friction that's a bigger problem, in my opinion. Um, uh, yeah, and then Connor mentions, yeah, I'm trying to build some tools to help with this. I absolutely am. I'm writing an R package, which doesn't require you to learn any fancy new language or scripting or anything, but lets you mark up your existing analysis scripts to make those network diagrams that I showed, those workflow diagrams, so that they're reviewable and browsable, and we'll make a report out of it. Okay. I think we've almost wait. Oh, there's more scroll. Sorry, I'm very bad with computers. James asks another question. How much value do you see in specific for scientists in philosophy of science? Back when I was taking research methods, teaching research methods, I used to very explicitly include phil-sci components incredibly deduction, but I always struggled with wanting to present things in a non-prescriptive manner. This is the way to do things from a philosophical perspective, encouraging students to think about these things and identify and follow the logical consequences. Tends not to get far. It turns out thinking is hard and uncomfortable. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. I think some philosophy of science is essential. Like my book. There's the first part of it's a very thin philosophy of science, just to get people past simple Karl Popper ideas about how science functions. And I think that helps a lot, because in teaching statistics, you want to get people past the idea that testing null hypotheses is all there is. And so some philosophy of science is needed there. I mentioned Karl Popper in my talk today because not that Karl Popper knew everything, but he trained a bunch of really important students who had opinions completely different from his. And this led to a very nice revolution in thinking about how science is really practiced and how that integrates with norms. And I think that's been very positive in philosophy of science and in the sociology of science as well. And scientists knowing some of that is very good. I don't know exactly what to teach, but I said Karl Popper, in saying what the scientific community to enforce, he emphasized that this kind of intersubjective comprehensibility is an essential thing about scientific reports, is that we don't believe scientific results based upon the prestige of who produces them. We don't let people have private means of derivation. They have to show us in a way that we can make up our own mind about it. And I think that's now there'll be other ways of constructing norms of science, but that's a great start, right? That doesn't give anybody any particular power. So that's philosophy of science that's there in the classical view of it. I tend to be methodologically quite liberal as well, and let people try anything as long as they tell me the justification. But that's a different philosophy of science. Now, I think most of philosophy of science is not for scientists. So you don't want to teach it all, and that's probably where you got to your problem, James, where you found that like thinking is hard. I think philosophy is a field in and of itself that doesn't owe us anything. And a lot of the stuff they do in philosophy of science is really seriously about epistemological questions that won't be of use to scientists, even though they're legitimate areas of scholarly inquiry and logical derivation that philosophers of science do. That's their field. We're their subjects in a sense, but there's logical structure that's their subjects as well. And scientists don't need to know all of that to do good work. So we have to find some curriculum which is helpful to junior scientists and getting them past the mythologies of how science work, seeing its mess, but also understanding that it's always been messy, and it can work despite the mess, and revealing to us theories about why that works. Anyway, there's a long discussion to be had there, James, and I have opinions just like you do, but I think we should teach some. Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Mario, sorry, it's taken me a while to get to you, but you're the first person to ask about DAGs. I think structural diagrams, DAGs, are also just really cool for working with others because they're also just a great heuristic to get talking about scientific questions. What I have struggled in a social science context is just that DAGs tend to get out of hand very fast, yes, and blow up in complexity. I feel there is a lot of help in creating DAGs and mapping to correct statistical models, but finding the time to stop building the hairball model is hard. That's a good problem statement. I agree with you. I don't have a solution, um, but I agree. That's a big problem. I do think, if I could say one thing useful about that, is the expanded toolkit for working with structural causal models helps us in this, because once we define, so if we've got a clear estimand, then there are going to be, most of the DAG becomes irrelevant. Yeah, so the whole causal system is not the goal. Though that might be, it might be that your life's work is to figure out the whole mechanistic system. But in any particular study, there are going to be uncertain parts of the structural causal model which you don't need to resolve, and you can figure that out logically by declaring a clear estimate. And then you can say, oh yeah, we have these open questions about these other variables, or it could be this way or that way, but none of that is necessary to answer this question. And that's an important advantage as well, that helps you stop the just keep adding stuff to the hairball sort of problem. Does that help? I mean, I think that's a real thing. Absolutely, is that there are a bunch of DAGs which end up being logically equivalent for specific questions, and then you don't have to resolve all those issues, and that gives you a workflow to break the loop of adding complexity, if that helps. Thomas asks, could Gen A act as an interactive tutor in setting up workflow? Absolutely. I think AI agents still have a way to go in being designed for as scientific collaborators, but it is, if you're using them incrementally to interrogate particular steps, or reveal derivations for things, or ask which assumptions would be appropriate here, they can do some things already. Absolutely. And people build skill files all the time. Claude has these markdown files called skills. Some of you who work with Claude know about this, which humans write. Humans write the skills, and the skills are workflows. Like people at PyMC Labs have these Claude skill workflows, which are based upon the work that Gelman and Vetri and I have done on Bayesian workflow. So they basically teach Claude to follow our workflow and do the tests. And then if you ask Claude to follow our workflow, it pulls up that skill and it goes through it incrementally and reports each step and its tests. And so I think we need to write that structure for them sometimes, but I think there is a future where these agents are saving us a lot of time by automating tests, but following a rational workflow that people have designed. But there's some room to go there. It's gotten very, very easy to make agents, and so there will be lots of experiments in the coming years. People saying thanks and leaving. Yes, thank you all for staying. And oh, there's been more stuff. Okay, I think I got to the end.